right, once again, my name is Ari, and I am introducing to you tonight my friend Heather. And Heather, I'm going to have you introduce yourself and then get going.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Good evening, wherever your time zone may be. I was on a call at noon with someone in New Zealand who was just waking up. So I assume we're in the general realm of evening, but wherever you find yourself. Hello, and my name is Heather Lundy. And I think in the spirit of this context of Awkwardly Zen, I'll give you both just my background professionally, which informs this conversation, and a bit personally, which also informs this conversation that I may not lead with in other settings necessarily, because I think understanding my spiritual background can kind of help inform how I'm entering this essential conversation of how we check in with ourselves. So first, I'm a licensed therapist. What I'm doing tonight is not therapy. There is some educational components from my training. I am an entrepreneur in the mental health world. So I actually don't know if you know this, Ari, but I've started 4 mental health companies. And my main focus is Chesed Wellness. And Chesed is a mental health, outpatient mental health therapy nonprofit that makes services affordable for the underinsured, which is most of us when it comes to mental health. And so I do that for the most part in my world. And also I do see clients minimally. So I love the work of therapy, and that is part of my professional and personal passion. And then I think it's also helpful for you all to know that I have been trained in theology. I do not identify as religious. I identify as spiritual, and that is very much central to my life, but that is part of my background. And I also was raised in a family. My grandfather is a famous evangelical pastor. So I was raised in a very specific religious context. I do identify with they, them pronouns. And I'm excited to jump in and talk with you all today. Anything else you want to add as far as an intro goes, Ari?
No, I've just been blessed to work with you in Chesed, and I cannot wait for you all to get the insights that Heather has. I'm excited for it.
Okay, right on. So I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to share my screen, and I invite you to write down questions along the way. Feel free to include it in the chat. I will wait till the end to answer questions, just in the spirit of the flow of what I'm sharing, but there will be plenty of space for us to have a discussion after I'm done sharing with you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then that will help guide our time together. All right, can everyone see the title slide, how to check in with yourself? All right, thank you for your hands, Ari. And the rest of you. I'm going to expand my screen to hopefully see as many of you as possible. Okay. So, conversation, how to check in with yourself. Now, yourself is not a typo. I'm going to start there. I intentionally separated out your and self because I want to talk about this idea of the capital S self. And also we're gonna really dig into the different components of this title along our conversation. So why are we checking in, right? You could ask yourself. What causes us to check in with ourselves, and who is the capital S self? When we say that, what do we actually mean? And so I think to begin, it's important for us to both clarify when we're talking about ourselves, often what people are talking about is intuition. And intuition is as much about the part of us speaking when we aren't listening. So the example I often give with intuition is Well, I'll just give a personal example. I grew up in a religious setting, and my specific community uh, believe that homosexuality is wrong and it's bad. But I identify as queer, and that was part of me from as long as I can remember. And even though I was in this environment and this culture that had a specific worldview, there was this part of me speaking in the background all along the way. And we often hear about this, where there's this part of us that just, it could almost intuitively feel like a whisper, right? Or this voice that's speaking within a context and also transcendent of a context. Our intuition is also the part of us that we're learning how to hear. When I have conversations as a therapist with people who are wanting to learn their intuition, we sometimes have conversations about, what does your intuition sound like? What's the tone of the voice? And so there's kind of this dual interesting component where intuition isn't one or the other, it's both. And it comes up in different contexts for different reasons and in different ways. And I think the other component when we're talking about, I had a quote by Albert Einstein. I thought that was later. So this quote by Albert Einstein, I think, is incredibly pertinent to how we think about intuition and the capital S self in the present day and in our present context. So it says, the intuitive mind, or he said, the intuitive mind is a sacred gift and the rational mind is a sacred servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. And so I also want to acknowledge that our greater environment influences how we think about intuition and the capital S self. Now, as far as some synonyms to the word intuition, a definition for the word intuition is an instinctive feeling. It's often talked about independent of rational consciousness, right? Intuition can be related to rational thinking, and it can also be transrational. A very small example, the name of my company is Kesed Wellness. The word Kesed is Hebrew for loving kindness. That word means so much to me. It's a core philosophy of my life because it contains this philosophy within the ancient Hebrew tradition that as we spread loving kindness, especially to those on the margins, the whole society thrives. But when I named my company Kesed, I can't tell you how many people told me that was a bad idea. They said it's very hard to translate in the English language. Unless you're familiar with the word, it'll usually get mispronounced. We don't often have words that are spelled K-H-E-S-E-D, which is how it's spelled. And yet there was this sense in me that that is the name of this mental health nonprofit that I was starting. And in a way, you could say that was contrasting rational marketing practice. And yet I just knew that philosophy had to guide the name of this company, right? So sometimes intuition can contrast rational thought. Sometimes intuition supports rational thought. How do you explain that gut feeling you get when you're on a date and you realize that this person is a really good fit for you, to the best of your knowledge, compared to when you may be on a first date and just know before you even ordered that this is not a good fit for you? You can speak to some cues, right? Maybe you didn't feel heard when they were asking you a question. Maybe they didn't even ask you a question. Or on the contrast of feeling that attraction, maybe it was in a way that they looked at you. Maybe eyes mean a lot to you, and there's something that you saw in their eyes that drew you to that person. So if I were to ask you to parse apart the rational components of attraction, there's ways that we can draw from it, but then there's also something beyond it, right? There's this inner voice, this inner power. In different societies and throughout history, we have often heard the word heart be connected to intuition, or the center of our being. Center is often a word that we talk about when we talk about intuition. The gut, trusting your gut, right? That can be another synonym. Even the word psyche. One of the things I love talking with people about is the word psychology literally translates, if you look at the ancient Greek. I'm trained in a bit of ancient Greek. I love it, love to bring it up when I can. But if you were to translate the original word of psyche and logos, it's a word about the soul. So psychology, the word psyche actually translates to soul, or if that word feels a bit loaded or cumbersome for you, the invisible parts that make up who we are. That's another synonym. One of the things I've loved is how the word self can often be described as a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. So the capital S self, our center, the seat of where the invisible parts of us come to fruition, can be this bridge between what we are consciously thinking and also the sub and unconscious parts of us that are informing where we are. So ultimately, intuition and self are all part of our awareness. And again, you can say awareness is part of us, right? But it's also transcendent of our body. It doesn't have the same constraints of our physical form, in the sense of, well, let me give this example. I have a friendship in my life where out of nowhere, consistently, there's been multiple patterns where they've said, hey, I was just thinking about you. And they sent me a message. And I was literally just thinking about that person. There's nothing rational. I just heard a lot of nods. Yes, thank you. There's nothing necessarily rational about that situation. But there's something deeply intuitive. And I'm not just talking about like every Monday at noon. I'm talking several months have gone by and out of nowhere, right? And so what do we do with that? What do we do with this awareness that makes up who we are? That, yes, we can track neurological synapses. We can look at childhood events for how it's informed us. But then also there's these other parts of who we are that transcend those stories. Transcend and include is kind of a phrase that we can often use when we're talking about learning who yourself is and checking in with yourself. So how do we learn ourselves? I think that that's kind of a part one question. We in the end of what I'm talking about are going to get into literally how to check in with yourself. I'm going to give you some mantras that you can come back to. But my hope in this middle part is for us to first talk about how we learn ourselves, because that informs how we check in with ourselves. And so there's these tagline steps that I'm going to share with you, and I'm going to include a question that you can come back to. Perhaps when you're in navigating a moment where you're asking yourself, how do I trust my capital S self? How do I listen to my intuition and know what it's saying, and what do I do with that? So the first component of how we learn ourselves, I'm going to go through a series of stages, and really they're a series of spaces that we inhabit through our human development. So this is going to be a little bit of my psychology bent speaking, but it's also informing the spiritual, because first of all, I'm not someone who believes those things are compartmentalized. I believe that there's a oneness to our whole selves. But when you're looking at human evolution and consciousness development, there's specific components to what that includes. And the first one is this component of growing up. And when I say the word grow up, what I mean is the process we go through of expanding our consciousness. So the question that I invite you to consider will make sense in just a second. The question is, how big is my home? Okay, so when you think of your home, what comes to your mind? And I'm not asking you to act, I'm asking you to self-reflect in this moment. What comes to your mind when I ask you the question, how big is my home? Are you literally thinking about your physical space? Like your own personal home? When I ask that question, are you thinking about your city that you live in? The home of your community, right? I imagine if we all took a shower today, that water is connected to pipes. And maybe you have your own well, but somebody connected that well, right? Many of us are connected to city water. So there is literally this connection that we share with a collective that is beyond our own physical personal home that makes our life possible. That's just one physical example. But when you think of your home, do you think of your city? Or do you even think of the universe when you think of our home? Right? Environmentalists are talking a lot about the fact that in order for a person to understand environmentalism, they first need to be connected to their own body. Because only when we are aware of our own body can we connect to the world around us and have the same relationship to earth and environment and nature as we do to ourselves. If we're disconnected from ourselves, we have a hard time connecting to things outside of ourselves. Right? And so when you think about home, I'll go back to this question. What comes to your mind? In psychology, the evolution of growing up is very much dimensional. So here's what I mean by that. Let's start at the me stage, right? My house, my space. Ego development is an essential component of human development. Understanding who I am compared to who you are is an essential part to human consciousness and expansion. One phrase that comes out of that ego development is my body, my rules, right? You first have to understand it's your body and you have rules that govern your body to be able to navigate the environment around you. So ego can often get a bad rap, and I think that it can wreak havoc in our lives. But it's important to know that each stage, while iterative and expansive, all have important components to understanding how human consciousness forms and matures. So the me stage is obviously the first stage. And then as we expand as humans, our consciousness expands to we, right? Where we consider the city that we're part of, the state we're part of, the country we're part of. Maybe the sports team that you really like, right? And you have a jersey of that sports team. That's a we dynamic. And so we is where ethnocentricity forms, where you can have a connection to a greater collective beyond the whole of yourself. And then as human consciousness expands further, we have this everybody awareness, the awareness of our relationship to the collective whole of humanity. Technology has brought this to a forefront on a whole level. The awareness of the relationship between our birth chart and the planets can be another form of this tradition. The awareness of our relationship to the environment. If any of you are kind of integral theory people, this connects to that idea of a holarchy or a holon, that you are a whole and you're part of a greater whole, and those dimensions can kind of ever expand. So when you understand yourself, there is truly this sense that you are a self. You are your unique self. And our awareness of ourself expands alongside our awareness of others and that which is beyond ourselves. Okay? The second component of this question is this idea of cleaning up. As a part of both understanding who is ourself and how do we listen to our intuition and check in with ourself. Cleaning up is an evolutionary process. And I mean that in every sense of the word. It evolves our ability to understand ourselves and understand where there is a constriction to our own flow of energy, where trauma gets stuck is sometimes a phrase that we use in the psychology world. And every component of development has light and shadows. So again, I want to be careful that we're not entering into like a duality of shadows are bad and light is good. I want us to more approach this from a posture of compassionate awareness. We all have shadows, and understanding who our shadows are is essential to our learning who our self is. So I'm going to give you a brief example, and I'm just going to use my own story along the way because that's the best way I know how to capture experience anyway. I used to have a lot of struggles with the institution of church. Okay. And there's several reasons why, but I'll just give one main example. I was disowned and rejected by most people from my church when I came out as queer. Now, that's not everybody's experience. Okay. So I want to be thoughtful that this was my experience from my specific background. And I also had close friends in the queer community who had similar stories, and they became allergic to anything church. They didn't want to go into a church building. I've been with queer friends who went to a concert in a church building and made comments like, I'm thankful that I didn't, get lit on fire going in here. There's true trauma and resistance to this institution that translates to the architecture. It translates to the language. And I was resistant to this part of my story for very understandable reasons, for my trauma and my discrimination. And I will always remember I was having lunch with a friend of mine, really a mentor in my life. And I was talking about my frustration. And I'll always remember my friend looking at me and saying, okay, so who is the church for you? And I just said, well, like the whole thing. The whole thing has hurt me. And they said, no. I mean, like, give me, like, think of the faces of the people who hurt you. Because when I was casting my shadow onto an institution, that's immaterial and it's impersonal, right? But if I let myself connect to the faces of my wounds, then that's something that I could actually work through and get to the other side. Because what shadows do is they can constrict energy flow. They can dilute energy flow. They can distort energy flow. And they can linger certain kinds of energy. So one of the things that my wound that I was putting onto an institution caused me was a resistance to dive deeper for a time into my own spiritual journey. That can be an example of what happens with our shadows. We miss a beautiful opportunity for me of exploring spirituality beyond what I was handed in my childhood when we let a shadow linger and don't look at who are our shadows. I think another component to cleaning up is realizing that it's part of our work to look at our own inner shadows, the ways that we've broken our own trust with ourselves, the ways that we hold shame or guilt, regret, right? It's this ability to let it all have a seat at the table. And as we understand and move through who are our shadows, that can help clarify who is ourself. Because if we don't lean into who are our shadows, then it can get blurry or noisy in trying to clarify who is ourself. It took me years to understand who am I independent of the stories I was told of who a queer person is growing up. And we all have those in different ways in our own stories, in our own process of navigating shadows. The third component of learning ourselves is waking up. Now, kind of the tagline in the psychology world is this idea of waking up to our unique self. So if you're going to have a capital S self, we're going to have a capital U, your unique self. And so the question is, who am I? Right? Who am I beyond my labels? Those tell a story, but they don't tell the story. Right? Who am I through my own unique experience? Who am I through what I'm uniquely here to do, and how I uniquely what uniquely makes up my personality, and also, yes, my intuition. Who am I? Now, when Heather was very young, I'm on the right with my cousin Caitlin, who we both wore dresses our moms made for us. My cousin Caitlin and I were best friends, and we were basically like twins growing up. My mom had, do you remember puff paint? She had a puff paint business. She made puff paint earrings, puff paint sweatshirts, and that was my childhood. But I show you this picture because this is a version of Heather that shows my inner child. I see such a purity and innocence to Heather's smile, and a pure essence to who Heather was in the world. And I also see in this picture everything that was put on me of who Heather is by my parents, right? Because your parents stress you. And I was a child. I didn't know who I was. Now, I got a little bit older and realized that I liked playing dress up with ties. So I took my little cousin Ryan's tie, and we played business one day, and I was the CEO, go figure. That was a foreshadowing that I didn't anticipate. But then there's kind of this playful essence to a couple years later of what Heather was. And then this is a picture of me when Heather was 25. So almost 10 years ago. And this picture is particularly endearing to me because I see it's almost like a tender exhaustion in my eyes. I had just come out as queer and was freshly navigating life as a more authentic person in my context. And this was my full awareness of who I was, right? This was a picture from 2 months ago at a wedding I was at. And this is a picture of my authentic self. Now, what I also want to show you in these couple pictures is that I don't view these earlier versions of Heather as any less authentic. They were part of me learning who I am. And they all have components of who I am. And they were also part of this bigger narrative of evolving, right? And evolving is kind of a core thematic word to our whole conversation about how we check in with ourselves. It's an evolutionary process. Learning who we are is our own inner evolution, which I trust if you give me 5 more years, I'll have a new picture for you. But that's kind of what I'm speaking to when I invite you to check in with who am I. Now, a fourth component is what's my part? What's my unique part in the world? So this is the idea of showing up, right? You're growing up, you're expanding your consciousness about others and yourself. You're waking up, right, to your own unique self. You're doing your shadow work in being able to see your own shadows. And then you're showing up to engage in your own path. And the thing about showing up and asking yourself, what's my part, is all about listening to your own intuition. Because again, rational thought can only get us so far. It's a great servant. But the gift is our intuition and this bigger self that can help guide this process. So I went to college, and I started college as a pre-med major. I will always remember being in biology lab, and the blonde lights were over me, and it was like a 3-hour lab. And I realized in that moment, this is not for me. It took me about 2 seconds. And I have a huge admiration for all my surgeon friends in that world. But what I learned was that it took me one lab to sense this is not for me. And I ended up studying art in college. And I remember the whole time having my own inner dialogue of, I don't understand why I'm studying art, but it's the only thing that makes sense. And that's all I knew. I could give you examples of how art inspired me in ways that other subjects didn't, how it challenged my own awareness in ways that my other classes didn't in the same way. But there was also this deeper sense that this is my path. And then I studied psychology because I wanted to live in Denver. And I found this school, and it was in my first class. I will always remember this as well. I was in counseling theories, and we started talking about the history of psychology. And there was just this moment. It wasn't even an emotional moment in class. Just imagine a professor and PowerPoint slides from the 1990s and just bland material and clip art. But there was something inside of me that came alive and had this full body, I could say full spirit, yes. And that's been a path that I've followed ever since. So knowing how to follow your intuition is part of learning what is your unique part in your own story. Now, the last one, listen in. So all of the ones before were, grow up, wake up, show up, clean up. But listening in is intentional, because a lot of conversation when it comes to intuition and checking in with yourself ultimately revolves around the center of who has authority in your life. So many of us grew up in environments where external authority informed ourself, right? That could be gender norms. That could be different aspects of socioeconomic things. That could be cultural. That could be the state you're from and the specific unique culture of the state you live in, right? We have these external things that assume authority to tell us who we are, right? I was raised to believe that I am someone who gets married and has children and supports a husband. It took me time to learn that pretty much all of those things were flipped. I am here to be a business leader. I am here to be someone who is queer. So you can go through these juxtapositions of what are these external systems that told us who we were, and then eventually coming to a point in our own story where we start to listen, including some of that information, right? Like knowing the family that I'm part of is important. It's part of my story. So it's not in judgment or rejection of those external forces, but it's about including and transcending them to translate that authority from inside outward. So imagine that movement from authority being like arrows coming into us compared to authority now transferring to arrows going outside of us. And it's not linear, it's reciprocal. So the reason I even said the phrase listen in is it's not about rejecting stimuli, it's about learning how to metabolize all the stimuli. Because one of the things that I learned in my own growing up was seeing that there's a far bigger world around me than the one I came from. And there was a little while there where it was overwhelming because I was being thrown all these different viewpoints about reality and how life works and how relationships work. And then there's this process of learning, well, what do I believe? What am I sensing? What do I do with that? Because in a way, you could say, I had to come to the point of getting brave enough to break my own rules, to listen to myself. And so when I say listen in, what I'm really saying is learn how to have a center that you're always coming back to, regardless of the flow of information. Now, one of the kind of points of self-awareness that I often bring up to people is that intuition can get used as a tool in a regressive way, right? So from the world that I come from, there's ways that intuition was used that was really ego-driven or could create kind of absolutist perspectives of this is the only way. So one example from my history is a pastor saying, God told me to lead my family. God told me that I am the leader of my family. And so this pastor was using the ultimate authority, God, to justify his behavior of being patriarchal in his family. And as you can imagine, there's no real way to take rational thought to just dismember his perspective. That's his perspective. But it was ultimately taking all the energy and bringing the power and the centeredness back on his ego. Right? But there's also ways that intuition can transcend logic and expand our perspective when we listen in. So for me, standing fully in who I am was part of me looking at where I come from and saying, I see it, I accept it, I love these people. And I also see something beyond this world that feels essential to me embodying myself. So if you would have asked me where myself is when I was closeted as a teenager, I would have said myself is on some island far away, enjoying coconut out of a real coconut and taking a break while I am navigating where I found myself in that moment. But my inner self felt far away to hold on to all of the things that I was told are who I am in the world I came from. I often ask this question to my clients when we're doing work on our inner self and work on our intuition, because when you slow down enough and you're navigating, say, a decision, or you had a spiritual sense or an intuition or communication on a spiritual level, if you slow yourself down and ask yourself, where is myself? Is it at home in my center? Is it on the other side of the house because you haven't been very connected to yourself for the last couple days? And so you're making decisions out of rational thought and struggling to slow down and create space to listen to your center. Where is your center? Where is yourself? Okay, so that leads back to the very practical, how do I check in with myself? Right? So we went through like what informs yourself, but how do you check in with yourself? Now, is anybody on the call, you could do your hands if you feel comfortable, familiar with internal family systems theory? Some shakes, okay. So internal family systems theory is a psychological theory that says who we are, ourself, is made up of many parts. We're all born with parts. We can also have new parts that develop in our lives, particularly through trauma. But our parts have different roles. But even within our parts, there is the center, the capital S self. That is the seat of compassion and intuition and inner knowing, right? Going back to some of those synonyms, inner power, inner voice. And then these other parts have specific rules. So there's three main themes to the parts that inform ourself. One is exiles. We all have exiles. These are the parts of us that we have exiled. So one good example can be maybe you've exiled your inner artist and have just accepted that you're not creative. For years, I exiled my inner queer for the sake of assimilating to straight culture. So we have different parts of us that we exiled. The second part that we have, and this isn't like only one part, but kind of another theme of parts, is what's called the firefighter. The firefighter is the one who comes in and firefights stress, firefights trauma. They literally put water on whatever is perceived to be a fire. Now, the thing is, the firefighters get us in trouble because we put out fires that we perceive that may not be real. That can often be the difference between a well, I'm getting tongue-tied. A firefighter developing through a trauma, right? Maybe you went through a season where you were completely financially at a loss and you genuinely didn't know how you were going to pay rent. And so you had this really quick, stress-induced reaction to try and resource rent any way you could. But then you notice that when you had another season of your life where there was plenty of resources to cover your rent, that you still had the same amount of stress and that you were still reacting to the resource of money like you did when you didn't have money to pay rent the next week. So our firefighters can carry this lingering sense of needing to put fires out that are no longer there, but they're ultimately protective. The other protector is our manager. So our manager is the honor roll student. Now, some of us may have acquired that just by our nature, but this is the part of us that tries to do everything it can to manage ourself and our life. It's the perfectionist. It's sometimes the part of us that wants to control situations that we inherently can't fully control or isn't ours to control. The manager is the one who keeps everybody in line. It can often be the voice inside of us that carries a condescending voice. The self-critical voice can often be our manager. And again, your manager and your firefighters are there to protect you. But there are also parts of us that don't ultimately trust our capital S self, who's the best, most centered part of us to make the decisions. So what I often talk with people about in therapy is that when you first learn how to check in with your capital S self, your center, your intuition, your inner power, ask yourself who's driving your car. Who's driving your inner car? Now, I was carless for years, so maybe it's who's driving your inner bike. Who's driving your inner car? What I often say is the managers and the firefighters can sit in the back seat. We need them in the car. They help inform us, but they don't get to drive and they don't get to choose the music. The exile gets to sit in the front seat because they need to be out of the corner. But yourself drives the car. And if you notice that you're a manager or a firefighter is the one who's driving your inner car, the question I invite people to ask is, what would help them trust your capital S self to take over the steering wheel? So one of the kind of places we go to when you'll notice your manager, your firefighters are taking over your intuition or the seat of where yourself should sit, is noticing if they're fighting, they're running away, or they're freezing, right? That lizard brain, that automatic response, that's a good sign that we've given the driver's seat to somebody else. So all of that question to lead to these mantras. These mantras, my hope is that these can help be guideposts for how you check in with yourself. So the first one that I wanted to provide was when you're checking in with yourself, when you're listening to for your intuition, when you're learning the tone of how your inner voice speaks, or maybe this new dialect of how intuition is translingual, if you will. An important mantra to return to when you notice that a manager or firefighter is running the show, or maybe in exile, is the phrase, "That was then and this is now." That to me can be one of the things that's most helpful in returning to giving space for your capital S self to guide the conversation. Because often what starts to distort or shift listening to our capital S self is when we're pulling from past experience or future fears. But allowing that to be then, whether it's, and the word then, that can be past or future tense. Letting the future be the future, letting the past be the past, and returning to the now. I'm not just saying that from a conceptual standpoint. I'm actually speaking to that very much from where you notice your memories are pulling you. When we lose sight of that was then and this is now, we allow our unresolved shadows, which we all have, because that's part of a process. We allow those parts of us that are our protectors, but not very good centers, to lead our intuition. But when we can settle back into the now, we can allow space for us to listen to ourselves. So that was then, and this is now. A second mantra, it's an evolution. Going back to the very beginning, when I said, intuition, for some of us, it starts as that voice that was always there when we were in a setting that didn't resonate for us, right? When we were in an environment where we were told, this is your role, this is who you are, this is what it means to be human, this is what spirituality is. And there's this sense that we had that there was more, that there was a distinction in our perspective. Maybe we didn't know what it was. But it's an evolutionary process to learn when our intuition is speaking from our center, or when our intuition, or what we believe is our intuition, is our shadow speaking. So I think really what I'm trying to say in this mantra is a tender embrace of noticing your own evolution rather than judging. So one of the things that we talk a lot about in mental health is the fact that right now you are the subject of your experience, right? You're living your life, you're doing your relationships, you're waking up and showing up for your daily routine or your job or whatever it is that you do in your day. But then one day, your current experience is going to become an object of your experience. So what I mean by that is, imagine yourself kind of going on a balcony and being able to look down on your experience. You can now observe it with a whole new awareness of what you've gone through. We just did that with photographs of me as an earlier age. I observed the experience of Heather as earlier ages. But right now, I am the subject of Heather's experience right now. I don't have that same awareness. I'm living my experience. And so part of embracing the fact that it's an evolution is trusting the process of the evolution, of not expecting yourself to observe your experience right now when you are living it, but knowing that that comes, right? Some of us may lean on that principle of impermanence. And we also can take with us everything that we've learned up to that point and how it shaped us and how it can help inform. Now, often where I see people get stuck in intuition is wanting the perfect formula, the perfect routine, the perfect way to be able to know when it's their intuition speaking and how to listen to it and just have it be this simple, clear-cut thing. But in my experience, it's far more of an iterative learning. Because maybe you'll go through an experience and believe that it's your capital S self, and you've checked in and you take action. And then the next day you realize, well, that's not resonating. So was the previous day a failure? Or was it part of the evolutionary process that's guiding your greater awareness of how to listen to your intuition? A third mantra, and this is one that I think to me can be kind of one of the best informers to how to check in with yourself, learning that everything is your teacher. So obviously I'm drawing a little bit from some Buddhist thought in this phrase, in this mantra. But in psychology, one of the things that we talk about in this approach is even looking at something like anxiety as your teacher. Rather than approaching your anxiety as how can I make it go away as quickly as possible, to instead approach your anxiety of curiosity. What is my anxiety teaching me about this situation? What is my anxiety teaching me about myself? and seeing that, again, rather than judging anxiety as bad, to incorporate that within this greater awareness and capital S self and intuition of how can that be a teacher in how you check in with yourself. Because if we only become about eliminating what we sense is not good and elevating what we sense is good, then we miss out on the full spectrum of the experience. Because there's a gift somewhere in that thing. That person who annoyed you, not saying that it was okay, not saying it was fun. And there's a gift. So what could that be? And our intuition can often help us out with that. And then the very last one of the mantras, the universe is rigged in favor of our growth. So let's go quantum physics real quick, in case you didn't think we were gonna head that direction in our conversation. When you think about a molecule is a collection of atoms. And a molecule has parts to it that atoms do not. So there is this holistic shift that happens when a collection of atoms become a molecule. They become something that atoms are not. They're a whole new thing, and yet they evolved from atoms. And as molecules evolve to cells and organisms evolve to different species, we start to see how we draw from the previous quantum components, if you will, that help inform the more complex organism, human species that moves towards. What we also know about the universe is that it's expanding. We're constantly expanding physically, astrophysically, if you will. And so when I say the universe is rigged in favor of our growth, I mean this quite literally, and I also mean this quite symbolically. And what we know about growth is that how it evolves us makes us into something completely new that wasn't who we were before. So I think the last thing to think about when you're checking in with yourself is that checking in with yourself is ultimately the art form of your own growth, of being able to become aware enough with yourself about when you listened to what you believed was yourself and it wasn't. Being able to be tender with yourself when you checked in with yourself and took action and everyone around you misunderstood you. Right? It's that dance and that art form. And so I think with this last mantra, what I hope you can receive is both a trust and confidence that nothing is wasted. That as we check in with ourselves, it's a practice. We're learning ourselves. And also that it's rigged in favor of our growth. We're on this path where we can take what we learn and help it inform where we head. And with that, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for holding this space with me. Thanks for listening to me for almost an hour. I did want to let you all know, if you do want to get in touch, I would love for you to check out Kessed's website. You're also welcome to connect with me on Instagram. But I wanted to now create some space for discussion, unless Ari, you want to jump in.
No, I think that was absolutely riveting. So we didn't get a whole lot of questions over in the side there. Does anyone have any questions for Heather or need any clarifications? I'm watching the room here.
And Ethan, I just want to acknowledge, I appreciate the spelling of chesed. It's often used with the CH.
All right. It doesn't look like we have any questions. So could you just, since we put Kessed's website over there, kessedwellness.com, could you just tell people, because there is some support for those people who are not in Colorado. I don't know if we're officially in our other areas yet. So could you just talk a little bit about like the services Kessed provides for the Denver folks, and then what other options are out there for people who, you all know, you hear me say it a lot in every Zen Zoom, like I'm a big believer in therapy, but maybe some mental health situations that people could tap into.
Sure, definitely. So I kind of fumbled a little bit earlier, but let me just reiterate. Kesed is a mental health nonprofit that makes therapy affordable for the underinsured. So our services are 50% market rate or less. We have a standard rate of service, meaning a therapy hour for $60. And we also have pro bono options. And I started Kesed from the belief that I believe that mental health therapy is a human right. I believe everybody deserves access to it if they want it and need it. And cost is the number one reason people do not seek out mental health therapy when they need it. And so I created Kesed to change that. We are the most affordable option nationwide. You may have heard of some national platforms like BetterHelp, which can be an affordable-ish options. I hear a lot of mixed reviews about how affordable it is. But the difference with Kesed is that we are centered on assigning clients to the best therapeutic fit. So what we mean by that is when somebody calls us for therapy, we talk with that person about what they're looking for, what personalities they even resonate with or don't with the therapist, and then match that person to the best fit. That's different than like getting a list of providers by your insurance or just going to somebody that you can afford. And so right now, Kesed is in Colorado, Texas, and Michigan. We are going to launch in California in January, and we're also planning to go statewide, or not statewide, nationwide over the next year. We offer virtual services, and we also have in-person options for our sites if you're in a local area that has a site. We also are always looking for site partnerships. That's part of the way that we grow. So we partner with local businesses that have part-time space appropriate for a therapy room. And so if you know anybody in the community who's looking for affordable therapy, reach out to us. We would love to grow. And as far as other resources, I know that there's a couple therapist directories that can be really helpful when you look for a therapist. So Kesed is outpatient, which is what people think of when they think of therapy. So we're not a crisis line, but if you're looking for a therapist, I recommend checking out inclusivetherapist.com. It's a therapist directory that matches people based on both, again, what they're wanting to work on and a type of therapist they're looking for. Psychology Today is kind of the largest national platform for finding a therapist in your area, and you can choose options such as reduced rates or sliding scale is a way that private practice often charges. So those are two places that you can check out. I also always recommend, if you don't know, you can call Lifeline, which is the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. That's free. But what a lot of people don't realize is that even if you may not be navigating suicidal ideation, Lifeline usually has the most robust directory of services in your state. So it's free. And if you're struggling to find a therapist, you can call that free hotline. I also know that they have chat options to see what recommendations they would have for your local area. Lifeline gets directed to each local state. I see a question. I'm going to look at the chat. It's not too difficult to find a therapist that specializes in internal family systems. That is something that you can search for in like Psychology Today. It'll often show the therapist what's called modalities is usually what it goes by, or theoretical orientation. I know those are very cumbersome words, but that typically are the taglines. But if you look on a directory, you can just see if they specialize in internal family systems. IFS is the acronym often used. Or if you look up a therapist and really admire them, ask them when you reach out to them. Just say, hey, are you trained in IFS? And then they can let you know. I do notice that therapists who have more training in trauma will often also be therapists who have training in IFS.
Awesome. Any suggestions for those suffering from bipolar disorder on how to cope with that? That's a big question.
Yeah, definitely. First of all, so much compassion for those who are navigating life with bipolar. I do often notice that bipolar can be an integrative need. So some people often benefit from kind of a collection of practitioners. So definitely a mental health therapist to help from the therapy standpoint of processing through navigating bipolar, as well as maintenance of supporting you with your bipolar, as well as what other forms of wellness and health work best for you. So I have friends across the spectrum that really benefit from services like acupuncture, Reiki, or maybe you have a really trusted relationship with your primary care physician or your psychiatrist. I think that the things that I always encourage people, whatever they may be navigating, is, do you trust your provider? And do you feel an alignment with your provider? And by alignment, I mean intuition. Do you believe that these people can help you in your own navigation of your wellness?
Okay. And then this is a great question. And then also, before we go into this, just basing off what you just said, if somebody doesn't feel that, if their intuition is saying this isn't quite the right fit, can you talk a little bit on the therapist side? Because we have a lot of, we talk a lot about in our groups, pleasers, right? People who are afraid of offending somebody. So who will stay in situations, say it with a therapist that they don't fit with because they don't want to hurt that person's feelings. So could you talk to that about why it's so important to trust that intuition and to find someone who fits with you?
Yes. I have a lot of tenderness towards this in particular because there's a power differential there, right? The therapist is there to help you, and you don't want to hurt their feelings. But let me return to that. The therapist is there to help you. So if you don't believe that they're helpful, and that could be seasonal, right? They're maybe just not helpful for you in this season. That's part of listening to our intuition, right? It's one thing to start hearing that voice when you check in with yourself. It's another thing to start listening to it. And that's essential. I think it's also important to remember that the number one job for a therapist, apart from keeping a client safe, that will always be our number one. Our number two job is working ourselves out of a job, right? And so if a therapist, if it feels like there's not traction, then the very reason that therapy is there for you isn't happening in the way that it needs to. I've had clients, I work a lot with identity development. And so I've had a number of clients come to me when they were in the midst of getting a divorce and their whole identity of their life was turning upside down and shifting. And then after the divorce ended, we finished care. They were finding their new way. And then before you know it, 6 months later, they called me again, and they were navigating a new job, a new relationship, and they wanted care again. If the therapist is aligned with the reason that they're there, they will celebrate when you advocate for your own needs in your season. If they don't, that's probably a good cue that you need to head out anyway. Now, I think it's also important to keep in mind that therapists are one aspect of your overall wellness. Probably not the best idea to make all the transitions at once. If you have multiple providers supporting you in your mental health, I often encourage people to take one change at a time, or make sure that you either have other support systems in your life that you know that you can lean on and check in with, so that it's not leaving you in a lurch, because finding a therapist can take time.
And on that, leads right into this next question. So brilliantly done. What kind of questions would you suggest asking a potential therapist to see if they're the right fit?
Great question. So I think baseline, do they specialize in what you're wanting to work on? Or is that part of their overall practice, right? If they're a couples therapist and you're needing therapy for your child, probably not a good fit, right? So the first one and the most obvious is, do they specialize in what you're navigating? The second one is maybe asking them, what do they believe is the role of the therapist? Because that can often tell you how they approach therapy. Do they approach it in more of a collaborative manner? Do they approach it more as the expert? And then I think the third component is asking yourself, what do you need in the person of the therapist? So this is beyond specialty. What do you need in the person of the therapist? So for example, we have clients at Kesed who will call us and say, I am trans identifying. I only want to work with a trans therapist. So for some, mirrored experience is essential. For others, it may be, I'm a direct communicator and I need to have confidence that my therapist is going to confront me and going to be direct with me. For another person, that may completely turn them off and they may not feel space to speak. So that third component is listening for what you need and then asking the therapist if they can provide that.
Within our community, oftentimes there's a lot of fear around that because there's so many things that are weird, right? That we feel out of touch with other people. So within the spiritual realm of things, is there a specific question you would have them ask about that to find someone who might be more spiritually minded, or at least open to spiritual thought processes?
Absolutely. I think asking an open-ended question is the best way to honor your own privacy before you feel that trust and comfort to be vulnerable and share. But the open-ended question is, how do you approach spirituality? Because the other thing to keep in mind is, depending on a therapist training, they may have been trained to believe that you leave spirituality outside of the therapy room, while there's other therapists who staunchly believe we are integrated beings and that's inherently part of who we are. But they also let the client lead in how they want that incorporated into a therapy session. But if you just open-endedly say, how do you navigate spirituality? Then you'll be able to hear in their answer, in their open-ended answer, not only how that may inform your own personal beliefs, but also how they navigate that within therapy itself.
Yeah, I think it's good to remember that therapists are also human. We say that with all of our practitioners here. So it's okay to find the human you connect with.
Absolutely.
So we have an anonymous question about, do you think that people who consider themselves mentally healthy people, do you think that they could still benefit from therapy?
Absolutely. I would say that question speaks to a bit of a soapbox that I get on about mental health, in that we often only think to turn to it when our internal house is burning down, rather than when a light switch isn't working in one of our inner rooms. And if we would attend to our mental health when we're doing well and we want to thrive, we're only expanding and leaning into our potential. And if we want to turn to it when, one inner light switch isn't working, then the ability to return to mental wellness is a far more streamlined path than if we wait until we're in crisis. So if I only had clients who were coming in because they were doing well and they just needed a quick check-in, I would love it. Love it. And I think that's another thing is finding a therapist that you can come back to. Because for some clients, they have an intensive need. For other clients, it's, as part of my overall wellness, I want to come once a month and I just want to kind of have a check-in. So yes, I celebrate both. I also see another question about IFS as a good fit for PTSD. It can be. What I would say is if PTSD is your primary point that you're navigating, make sure that the therapist is trauma informed and or trained in trauma. IFS will only be as helpful as the therapist knows how to navigate trauma in general. But usually they do.
All right. We have another question about navigating the bipolar disorder and relationships with family and friends or getting into a dating world. Do you have any resources on bipolar that you can think of that would be a good fit? Or would you suggest them getting in touch with a therapist, or how would you navigate that?
I have two answers. I think my first answer would be a lot of what's in that question is what therapy exists to help support and navigate. Because when you're living through something like bipolar, that informs your family system, that informs how you approach dating. And so I don't know that there's like a book or a podcast that I think would provide the answer. I think a lot more of it is listening to your own journey and your own path of health and wellness, and what that means for your relationships. And so, yes, I think therapy is a central support beam in that. And I think one other thing I just want to acknowledge is bipolar is one of those topics that is far more common than people give it space. And that does not by any means diminish the experience that people have in navigating it. But I want to just speak to the whole questions of relationships and dating and managing. Those are important questions.
All right. So we're going to wrap up this last question here, and then we're getting to the end of our time, which went so quickly. Is there a type of therapy that you recommend for trauma resulting from an abusive relationship? Once someone has been removed from that relationship and is trying to move forward, date again, make new friends.
So much. Yeah. First of all, I just hear that's a lot to hold and to lean into. And I want to be careful in saying that I think that this is part of checking in with yourself. There's multiple different avenues for treatment, if you will. There's not only one. What I can tell you is things like EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So you can imagine why they chose an acronym. That's one of the most common forms of trauma therapy that does link both processing and also bilateral stimulation to help with the neurology of trauma. That has been shown to support DV and learning your life post relationships. Another method for some is process therapy. Some people, EMDR isn't the best path for them, but if a therapist is trained and specializes in that area, process therapy can help. I want to acknowledge that we all process our trauma in a number of ways, and talking in therapy is one of them. I actually just talked to my own therapist this last month about how there was some trauma that came up for me in my past. And I felt this overwhelming sensation that I needed to go on a long bike ride. And I needed to like get it out through my body, like thinking about it, journaling about it. That's not what was going to help move the energy for me. And this is coming from a therapist. Where I'm most comfortable in processing. And so I think, yes, things like EMDR, things like working with a trauma-informed therapist, IFS could be another approach. These are all just techniques. But if you check in with yourself, what do you believe will help you move through some of those energies and feel support in the midst of navigating that.
Yeah. Thank you, Heather. And thank you so much for your consideration on those questions. It is nice to have a mental health care professional in the room with us, because I'm constantly like, no advice. We don't give advice. So it's nice that we can here. And I hope that you will come back and speak with us again soon. Again, Heather with Kesed Wellness at kesedwellness.com. And I am going to stop the recording and then tell you all a little bit about what's coming next.